Hello folks, welcome to another episode of the Pirate Round. I be Captain Scoutibus here, and this be the Scottish Raven. And we'd like to thank you for joining us here today on our show. And we got a really great, very interesting show for you today. So first we're going to get down to pour a toast to our friends who can't be here, to the friends we miss and we haven't seen in a long time, to new friends we've yet to meet, and those of the sort. And we're going to pour a toast of Blandy's Rainwater Madeira wine, which is quite a wonderful wine, isn't it?
Which we did in a previous review.
It's actually very fine.
A lot of history.
Very fine wine. A great deal of history with the island of Madeira. And
don't think that we've given up rum.
Oh no.
It's just that pirates didn't drink nothing but rum.
You didn't always drink all rum, but of course we haven't given up on rum, but we've got these bottles of Madeira that washed ashore, and we
took off a ship too.
And and the ones we captured, and so we're gonna, we got to have a bottle of something or other on the table with you when you're doing your pirate round. So, so folks, let's say a toast to getting through this whole thing together in the pirate community. And we love you all, and we miss you most sorely, folks. Stay strong, and welcome here to our show of the Pirate Round. Yar har.
I don't want to chug that. Those are just too fine to chug.
No, don't chug it.
So just a quick thing. The IPC, or International Pirate Community, is getting ready to release the deck of cards, which are of the female pirates. It is the year of the female pirate.
Oh, good.
And yours truly is the Ace of Spades.
That's true.
And there's
Lemmy would be proud.
That's right, Lemmy would be proud. I chose that one just because of the Ace of Spades.
There you go.
Because I'm kind of an Ace of Spades in my own way. So what do we have for us today, Captain?
Well, folks, first we've got to talk about a issue.
Navigation.
Yes, and that's navigation at sea. Now, navigation at sea is quite different than navigation on the land. On the land, you've got landmarks like rivers, mountain ranges, significant large trees, valleys and such. Roads, that kind of sort of thing. Navigation on the ocean wide, the seven seas, is very different. Now, of course, you do have landmarks such as certain islands or peninsulas, but once you sail far, far, far out into the ocean, away from any land, you've got no landmarks but the sea itself.
And there's nothing to say that maybe your ship doesn't drift one way or the other.
It's true.
Or turn one way or another.
Current and wind play a big part of it too. Now, before the great age of sail, and I'm saying 1600s into the 1700s, pilots, shipmasters, captains relied on dead reckoning, and they had some crude instruments where they could tell latitude. And latitude, of course, are lines, parallel lines that circumnavigate the globe. And they're at fixed points depending on islands or specific landmarks. And people know that this sort of island then is at this part of latitude, at this actual parallel. And they've got the equator set up and other things such as that so that they can tell where they are going east and west. Now, the problem with this, they begin to find, is that a lot of ships, a lot of shipping lanes were centered along these lines of these parallels of latitude. And so it made it easy for pirates and ships of other nations to lie in wait for ships as they sailed along these lines. And essentially because they couldn't deviate too far from latitude, without getting completely lost, ships tended to stick on these certain lines in these notable shipping lanes as they followed currents and notable winds and such, and they made themselves easy prey. So there are some good examples in the past. In the 1500s, some Portuguese ships returning from the Indian Ocean were ambushed by the British fleet, and enormous caches of treasure were taken. And of course, we all know about the Spanish treasure fleets, ambushed by pirates and English men of war who would wait in the shipping lanes for the big fat Spanish ships to come along and pluck the millions of gold and Spanish silver off them. So these ships managed to make their way along latitude, the parallels of latitude, using some rather crude sorts of navigational instruments,
Like the T-staff.
The T-staff or the backstaff or the
Astrolabe.
or the astrolabe or even something called the quadrant, or they called it even the octant, which was used to find the levels of the sun or the moon above the horizon. They could tell what time it is.
And a compass too. Just a
Well,
basic
yeah,
compass.
and a compass. The compasses were, somewhat reliable. They weren't the best reliable, but they could tell you generally which direction you were traveling, east and west, north and south. And now, almost any mariner could find noon at sea. It's the highest point of the sun, and they would have a fixed part of the ship, perhaps the quadrant or the backstaff, pointed up, and they could figure out where noon was, and so they could always tell that exactly that this is noon, and so then they would set the ship's clock at noon. However, they had no way of determining exactly what time it was in another part of the world, so they could tell exactly how far they had sailed. And how far they needed to sail north, south, east, and west would be determined by longitude. And longitude are long lines that go from the North Pole to the South Pole around the Earth vertically. And by quadrant yourself on a map of the sea, you could tell where you had gone by crossing your latitude with your longitude and pinpointing your location. However, up until this time, up until the early 1700s, there was no actual reliable way to find longitude at sea. And many people tried the astronomical method, which is basically observing the stars and the moons, but this is unreliable. And it wasn't until the early 1700s, around the 1720s or so, that people began to actually take this problem seriously enough to try to create a marine chronometer. Now, a chronometer isn't so much of a clock as it is a way to keep track of time. Where a clock tells time, a chronometer keeps track of time. So, that brings us to today. And we're going to talk about this, Longitude, a book by Dava Sobel. Now, I was lucky enough to get this book from the Scarlet Raven, and she gave it to me as a gift.
That might help with his navigation.
And she thought it would help with my navigation. It's a very fine book, and it tells the story of the true story of a lone genius who solved the greatest scientific problem of his time, and that is how to tell time at sea on a consistent and accurate basis. So, first, to illustrate an issue with how difficult it was and the damages that could be wrought by not being able to find longitude, I'll describe a little story that happened. And it took place with the French and the British fighting in the Gibraltar Isles in the early 1700s. And it took place aboard a fleet as they were sailing from Gibraltar north back around to England. It was 5 great men of war under the command of Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel. And as they were sailing, they believed that they were somewhere off Brittany, but they had lost their way in the fog, and they had lost their way in the current, in the ocean, the clouds, and they couldn't tell exactly where they were. Now, strangely enough, aboard the ship, the Association, the flagship, a common sailor, approached the captain of the ship and said, "Captain, I do believe we are not off Brittany, but we are closer to Land's End. We are closer to the Scilly Isles." Well, the captain, who held that navigation was the purview of officer class alone, had the poor seaman hanged on the spot for mutiny. Well, it didn't work out that well for the rest of the fleet. All 5 ships sailed too far north and ran into what's called the Scilly Isles. The Scilly Isles are huge rocks that drip off the ends of Land's End of England, kind of like blood off the ends of a dagger. And 4 of the giant men of war, including the Romney, the Eagle, the Association, floundered on the rocks and killed over 2,000 sailors.
That's 4 ships, heavily.
4 giant ships.
Which the British held to more value than men.
They were held to a great deal more value than men. Now, as luck would have it, the seaman who was hanged directly on the orders of Admiral Shovel, who believed that, of course, that no one but officers would be able to navigate ships. And as luck would have it, Admiral Shovel was one of the few to survive. As he washed ashore on the Isles, as he lay there insensible, a peasant came along and looked down at the admiral and took a liking to his emerald ring that he had on his finger. Well, she promptly slit his throat and took the ring and made off with it and killed the admiral. So we know this story is true because on her deathbed, the poor lady, well, I'm not going to say poor, she was murderous, but poor in the sense of financial terms, the poor lady confessed to the local priest and produced the admiral's emerald ring and said, this is the ring that I took from the body I found. And it turned out to be Admiral Shovel's ring. Now, folks, that's a really interesting story, and it's a great demonstration of irony. And it's stories like that about why I absolutely love history. Because, folks, that's a great story.
There's a great anecdote.
Yeah.
You know, and his want of you know, and it harkens back to even scurvy, that they weren't, that the British nobility class weren't really wanting to listen to those who were lesser class,
No.
so to speak. You know, and hence scurvy went on and on and on, and made the gentleman who had discovered one of the cures for scurvy, you know, question his own findings.
Exactly. Now, in this book, written by Dava Sobel, who actually is a science writer for the New York Times and has written for stories such as Autobahn and Omni and such as that, she tells the story of how the problem was solved, how people worked very hard to solve the problem of finding time, and it all came down to actually creating an accurate chronometer that you could use at sea and that would survive at sea for long voyages. Now, dead reckoning navigation, of course, moving from landmark to landmark is how the Norse found their way across the North Atlantic and into essentially the North American continent. Dead reckoning is how Columbus got to the New World. Dead reckoning is how pirates moved around through the different oceans. They followed the coastlines. They used word of mouth and tribal knowledge to identify rocks and such. But the problem with dead reckoning is it made long voyages much longer. And as we know that when sailors spent an extra long time at sea, they began to be ravaged by poor nutrition and sinking ships and, of course, scurvy. Now, we've talked about scurvy before on one of the pirate rounds, and I thought we did a very good episode on scurvy.
It's one of my favorite episodes.
Yep. That's a lot of history, and of course here at the Pirate Round, we like to talk a lot about history. We just don't sample rum and talk about piratey things all the time, but we talk a lot about naval lore and naval history. So later on in time period, and this would be around 1714, Parliament created the Longitude Act. And the Longitude Act was a prize awarded to the person who could come up with a practical marine chronometer or a practical way to tell longitude at sea, whether mechanical or astronomical. And by saying mechanical or astronomical, it divides the scientists of that day into 2 separate sets. Those who believed you could find longitude by the astronomical means, essentially just staring at the moons of Jupiter, our moon itself, the transit of Venus across the sun or wherever, or those who thought that they could take the idea of creating clocks and make one that was sturdy enough and accurate enough to take to sea. Now, at this time, there were quite a few clocks made. People had been making clocks since the 1400s. But for various reasons, they lost time. And they would lose as many as sometimes 10 minutes a day. Now, they could always be reset by a clocksmith or an astronomer who could tell exactly when it was noon by the travel of the sun across the sky. Then you could reset your clock and rewind it so you always knew it was accurate at least one part of the day. But that wasn't good enough for taking a ship, taking a clock on a ship to sea.
Right, besides clocks on land are big, gainly things with pendulums.
They're huge.
And you start rocking that pendulum.
Yeah. A pendulum clock is worthless at sea. It just doesn't work. The rocking of the ship throws the pendulum off.
Motions up and down.
Motions up and down, motion side to side. It throws the pendulum off, and it won't allow the clock to keep accurate time. So the Longitude prize was to be 20,000 pounds. And 20,000 pounds at that time was probably $3 or $4 million. And it was a tremendous amount of money. Anybody who got that amount of money would be fabulously wealthy. And we're talking, the early 1700s when you would be lucky for a person to be paid a few pennies a day in their wages.
In all honesty, most nobles really didn't have that money on hand. It was all fake money.
Yeah, and many of them could live on 500 pounds a year, even around that, or even more, or even less. And so this idea that you would pay someone 20,000 pounds for coming up with this foolproof way of telling longitude at sea, so that ships could be saved and so that fleets could be maneuvered all about the world. Well, it was a heck of a prize, and everybody seemed interested in it. But with all the crazy ideas, there were very few that were very practical. Which brings us to a village carpenter named John Harrison. And John Harrison was one of those men that just comes along at the time when you really need him, or women, depending, comes along at a time when you just really need his expertise and his genius. And he was to change not only the face of mechanics and design and engineering, but also the way people perceive time. And it would have a profound impact upon sailing, upon the science of the time, and even science of today, and astronomy itself. Now, folks, John Harrison was born on March 24th, 1693. And he had a simple upbringing as the son of a carpenter. But even young, he showed a proclivity for books and learning, and he could memorize books back and forth and quote them to people. And he was obsessed with reading and gaining knowledge through any means he could. And he already had a very early scientific sort of mind. He was sort of obsessed with certain things like telling time, like with sundials, or the occasional pendulum sort of mechanical clock that he saw. And he loved things like books, and he loved music, and he could tell the meters inside music and the mathematics of that, and it fascinated him. And it got him a little bit obsessed with measuring time. And so much so that he began to start making his own clocks. And he started, because wood was something he was familiar with, he started making them out of wood. And wooden clocks, you say. Why in the world would someone make wooden clocks? Well, wood, and certain types of wood, especially tropical woods, have the advantage that they self-lubricate, that they possess their own oils, and so there's no reason to oil them, because clock wheels and bearings made out of wood will oil themselves over time. Now, I know this because a long time ago, this here captain worked in a wood shop, and we had some exotic tropical hardwoods, including lignum vitae and rosewood, and they were very, very oily, and they stayed oily throughout their time. They never dried out, and that oil...
Some of the oils I know can cause you to break out in rashes.
Well, they can, yes. Some of the oils can be dangerous to people. I, for one, found out that I'm allergic to rosewood oil. And this wood, as it oozes these oils out over time, self-lubricates. And so Harrison made bearings for the clock and counting wheels for his clocks, and he made them out of wood, and they self-lubricated themselves so that they ran quite well. Now, in 1722, he made a clock in a clock tower for a lord's house, and the clock is still running today, 270 years later. All it needs is the occasional winding and a little bit of cleaning, and it still ticks along by itself. Now, he came up with two very interesting ideas about how to regulate clock speed. One is to create a different type of pendulum. Now, pendulums, because they're typically made out of a metal will expand and contract during the heat of the day or the cold of the night, and it will throw the clock off. Even if it expands just a microbit along its length, it will throw the clock off. So he created something called the gridiron, which is essentially two types of metal rods placed together in the pendulum. And the two types of unlike metals, brass or iron, will react differently when it heats up outside or cools down. And it prevents the pendulum from warping itself out of size. And so if it maintains its size over time, the clock will keep ticking at a regular rate and won't lose or gain seconds. Now, in order to regulate the speed of the clock, he created something called the grasshopper regulator, which is essentially looks a bit like a grasshopper's legs. And what it is a mechanism for slowing down and speeding up the clock and regulating its speed at a consistent manner, so that it would maintain the seconds, maintain its ticking of the seconds over time, and wouldn't accelerate its speed or get too slow. And the grasshopper regulator is something used in regular ticking clocks today. If you look inside a clock, you'll see this sort of arm with these two hooks at the end that sort of go back and forth like this along a gear, and the gear comes down and clicks and then it clicks to the next one and opens and it clicks to the next one and opens and clicks to the next one. But it regulates the speed of the large gear on the clock, and it keeps the speed at a consistent rate. Now, at this time, for some reason, and we're not quite sure, Harrison became interested in the prize, in the Longitude prize. And perhaps it wasn't so much for the money, but perhaps it was more so that he was just fascinated by this idea that he could create something better, a better clock. And he drew up a lot of his ideas, and he took them around to various people. And one of the people he took them to was the astronomer royal, Edmund Halley. Now we know Halley today because of Halley's Comet. But at that time, in the 1700s, around 1724, he was the Astronomer Royal of England. And he was busy at the Royal Observatory making star charts that people would use to map the skies and supposedly tell time using the moons of Jupiter or our own moon or the transit of Venus. And these star charts were incredibly valuable because astronomers all around the world used them to tell time and regulate time depending on which stars they saw in the sky. So Edmund Halley took one look at his drawings and said, this is beyond me mechanically. I'll send you to a clockmaker, and I know in London, who will help you out. And this clockmaker can then give you an idea about whether or not your ideas are practical, and whether you should take them to the Longitude board, which the Longitude board was set up by Parliament to evaluate people who were seeking to win the Longitude prize. And Harrison could take his drawings and his ideas to the Longitude board and present it to them to see if it would be practical enough for him to build his own version of the maritime chronometer.
Now, wasn't the Longitude board partly created because of Queen Anne?
Well, it's called the Act of Queen Anne, and the Act of Queen Anne created the actual act which stipulated that someone who found longitude would get the £20,000 prize. But in the actual Act of Queen Anne, which Parliament approved, it did create the Parliament Board. And on the board were learned scientists, astronomers, mathematicians, admirals, that sort of thing. And they never met very often, but occasionally some of them would get together and they would evaluate various ideas that people had for telling longitude at sea. One of the ones was a whole line of picket ships all the way across the Atlantic that would shoot giant skyrockets into the air, and they would be as time would, as every hour or every 3 hours, well, they would launch a rocket at Greenwich, England, and all the ships would see the rocket go up in a whole big, like a big giant nautical zipper all the way across the sky.
The problem with that is supplying the ships and having men living out there all the time.
Exactly. It would be 180 ships all the way across the Atlantic, and they would have to be within eyesight of each other too, so they could see those rockets. Rather impractical, There was another one called the powder of sympathy, where essentially you would go to sea with several dogs, and you would wound a dog at Greenwich. And because it was believed that if you put this powder in the dog's wound, and then also wounded the dogs on ships, you would also put this powder in the dog's wound. If you continued to wound the dog at Greenwich, the other dogs on the ships as they sailed would yipe at the same time as the dog in Greenwich. Now, I'm not making this up.
That's true.
They called it the powder of sympathy, which is essentially some charlatan's concoction of powder that they would cut these poor dogs and they would make them yipe, and
The two are connected mentally.
they would somehow connected through the sympathetic wounding of these
That
dogs.
seems like a bit of witchcraft.
Well, that's the thing. It started to tumble down into the idea of witchcraft. And then you had many of the astronomical ideas that people had, essentially that you could tell the time at sea accurately by using the moons of Jupiter or our own moon. However, our own lunar moon has an 18-year lunar cycle. And so you would have to have 18 years worth of lunar tables on your ship in order to complete your calculations accurately. And most people couldn't afford anything of the sort. They couldn't afford a giant book of 18 years of lunar calculations in order to tell time accurately using our moon. Now, strangely enough, the moons of Jupiter were then used by surveyors at that time as a way to tell longitude on land. And there is a way to do this accurately on land because, one, you can only as you're moving along on land, you can stop and start as you wish, whereas at sea you are sailing constantly. On land, at night, you can see the moons of Jupiter, and so you can stop, pound in a stake, and say, right here is this time, this is this longitude marker, and next morning we're going to move this distance, and we're going to find the next longitude marker by the moons again. Well, you can't pound a stake into the sea, obviously. You're sailing all around, the water's all around you. There are no fixed notions unless there's islands, but yet there aren't those convenient islands at the longitude places where you wish them to be. And so there are many, many impractical ideas. And so it led to a conflict between those who sought the solution to the problem mechanically or a solution to the problem astronomically. And this will lead to other problems later on, as we'll talk about. So we'll pour a little bit of fine Madeira out while we're talking. Now, Sir Edmund Halley sent John Harrison to a renowned clockmaker in London named George Graham. And he was called Honest George Graham because it was said that he never stole any ideas from people. And he worked on his own ideas, typically. And John Harrison took his drawings to see him, and he was at first he was a little bit suspicious because these drawings he considered to be his personal property, and they were very complex. But after a long day's talking and meal and lots of drinking, the two men sat down and realized that they had a lot in common. One is that they understood time and they understood clocks' inner workings, and they also understood the importance of the different mechanical aspects of clocks. The pendulums, the springs, the wheels, everything. And so it was like they were talking their own language with each other, like speaking their own personal language. And the two of them became great friends. So Graham took John Harrison to the board, or to the few members of the Longitude board that were meeting at the time. And they managed to convince the board that Harrison should be taken seriously. That he wasn't a gimmick person with barking dogs and exploding cannon shells and rockets and such a thing. But he was essentially a person who actually wanted to find a sound footing for the solution of a problem regarding the mechanical aspects of timekeeping, chronometry. And so with the help of Sir John Graham, of Honest John Graham, or George Graham, and the sort of approval of the board, John Harrison went back to his workshop and started working on H1. And H1 is what we call the first clock that Harrison made.
Right.
And H1, if you look at it today, you wouldn't even know it was a clock if you didn't see the dials upon it. It took John Harrison 5 years to make H1. And at that time it incorporated every single thing that he knew about mechanics of clocks. It had balance wheels, it had balance bars, it had certain spring activations, it had gears, it had everything in it. And it was a huge brass contraption that weighed 75 pounds.
These balls on top that rock back and forth.
With springs and balls on the top that would balance and go back and forth like this.
Balls on the bottom.
And it had counterweights on the sides that would raise up and down and hold things in place. And
with every little change, he instead of taking away, he added to, which added to the complexity of it.
It was, and it made it a little difficult for people to imagine how the thing was constructed, because if he was building a apparatus and it didn't work, he left it in place, and sometimes even left it connected. But then he built a second apparatus on top of it that would actually work. And so what ended up happening is that it had 4 dials on it for seconds, minutes, hours, and days. And at that time then you could tell like how many days you had sailed, how many hours and such. And they considered to be a work of art, really, as people looked at it. And people would stop by his shop just to watch it tick, because they couldn't imagine that something that complex and beautiful could actually be practical.
And having seen pictures of it and videos of it, it is a work of art. It's a mechanical, feat of genius.
It is. Now, folks, keep in mind that up to this time there was many clockwork machines throughout the world. There was the clockwork automatons that in Italy, the ones that would play cards, and the ones that would sing and dance and play instruments and move about, little clockwork machines that would walk here and there or walk backwards. There was even clockwork wagons that would go down the road for a short distance of time before they had to be wound back up. There was all sorts of things, all sorts of clever devices. But there was really nothing at that time that would accurately keep time at sea. And because the H1 device did not have a pendulum but had counterweights, and they even actually installed it in a big 4-foot cabinet where it was on gimbals. So if the ship was rocking like this, the clock would stay like this. It would stay, the ship would rock around it, and it would hold the clock in place like this. And the thing is that you could even rock the clock itself.
You could push it
and make it go, and it would still keep accurate time because its counterweights were unaffected by Coriolis effects and things like that. So, in 1735, HMS Centurion sailed to Lisbon and took John Harrison and his H1 device with it.
How much did he pay for that? Was there a cost for that?
Well, the thing is he never got any money for it. He made H1 in those 5 years out of his own pocket. It was his own device. And had he just stopped making there, he would have become somewhat famous for making an incredibly accurate clock that was not powered by a pendulum. He wasn't satisfied, of course. He had to keep working on it and to perfect it. However, during this voyage to Lisbon, the ship suffered greatly from stormy seas and lots of water and being chased by the Spanish about. They finally got to Lisbon, turned around and came back, and the clock was still keeping time. And when it got back to England, he found out that he could accurately calculate longitude within 60 miles of the charts that the English ship was using. So actually he had actually accurized the English charts by 60 miles so that they wouldn't miss, say, certain landmarks or the entrance to the Thames River, or they wouldn't miss this island. And the people who sailed with him were absolutely dumbfounded that, in a certain amount of time, by just using his calculations of his clock and charts, and by finding noon, he could find longitude, where it would take them all day to work out the moon tables, the sun tables, the Venus tables. All Harrison needed was his clock and his notebook and a marking of the sun at the noon mark, and he knew exactly where he was.
The big problem with it, though, it was big and ungainly,
It was very big and ungainly.
filling up a captain's cabin.
Yes, and the problem is that it could not be duplicated by anybody but him. It was essentially a one-off piece. It demonstrated how important it was to tell accurate time at sea, but it was so complex that it actually was impractical. And for this, Harrison decided, this isn't good enough. I've got to make something that's much more practical. I've got to make it smaller. I've got to make it portable. I've got to make it more robust. And I've got to make it so that I can take it to sea. Now, the sea journey, of course, gave him the experience of what a clock would actually undertake in a sea voyage. And he knew about the dangers, the exposure to moisture, to heat, to temperature, to everything. And so his next devices he would build would all incorporate these ideas in them, and thus he would get better and better and better with each device that he would construct. Well, and so eventually, after quite a bit of work, in 1741, Harrison created H2, which is his second version of his clocks, his chronometers. Now, H2 was constructed mostly of brass. It was tall and thin, not squat and short like H1. And it had a lot of, it was smaller and lighter and had a lot of refinements, to the point that he had gotten rid of the giant counterweights and replaced them with balance bars and different sort of cog wheels. And a lot of this was added on there to make it more robust and more resistant to temperature changes. And what worked so much about H2 is that the Royal Navy took a look at it, and the device was, maybe 2 feet tall and a foot wide, and they thought, well, that's something small enough to put on a ship. And it seems like it's strong enough and robust enough to survive a ship's journey. And it's on a gimbal, and it's swinging, the ship is going around it. The clock, even though it swings like this, it won't lose any time. You wind it once a day. It's more practical. It seems like this would be the way to go. Now, even though the Royal Navy approved of it, and there were some British officers in the Royal Navy who wanted to buy one off him right away and take it with them to battle. And they offered to give him money for H2 right then and said, Harrison, you've done a tremendous job. We need one now. We're going to go fight the French or the Spanish, and we need it. And
It's going to help us rule the seas.
And it's going to help us rule the seas. We'll find our way around, and here's your money, and thanks very much. However, H2 never went to sea. It underwent a lot of trials as for timekeeping. Every day you can accurately foretell what time it is by checking, at finding the sun at noon. And so you can reset other clocks, pendulum clocks actually. And so it turned out that H2 hardly lost any seconds over a year. And it was considered to be extremely accurate and very reliable, but also extremely complicated. So we moved from H1, that is incredibly complicated and very impractical, overly engineered, to H2, which is less complicated, but still very complicated and very difficult to duplicate, but is just as accurate, but still not quite as practical. So Harrison was not satisfied. He had been aboard ship with H1, and he knew that still, even now, this would still not be practical enough for everybody to use. His idea was that everyone, a ship's captain, even a land navigator, anyone can have a small portable chronometer with them to be able to tell time. And H2 just wasn't accurate enough. So he went back to work, and he received a few small stipends from the board of Longitude, usually about 500 pounds or so every few years. And for the next 20 years, from 1741 to 1761, he worked on H3. And H3 was to be his next clock, and some people thought it would be his magnum opus, his greatest creation, but it wasn't. It turned out to be just a stepping stone. But I get ahead of myself.
So with that, I think we're going to end this episode so as not to make this too overly long. We're going to do this in a couple-part episode. That way it's easier to follow.
Yes.
And we hope you enjoyed this short episode. And
Well, let's pour one out for our friends.
A little bit more Madeira.
Friends.
So as you can see, some of our crew has kind of vanished.
Well, we had a
There was,
mutiny.
there was another mutiny, and I'm not sure who's in charge of captains, but we've got Polly, Pi, and Bill.
Well, the thing about Polly is always here because she's our ship's parrot.
Right.
She's part of the crew, but she's not a captain or
She's not an officer.
an officer. She's the lookout, and you know, you always need a lookout no matter what. So Polly's a lookout. You know, you'll notice she has her eye patch where being drunk one day on rum, she was chasing a pigeon and sailed into the yardarm and lost her eye. And of course, we always have Pyrate, who controls our little cannon, our signal cannon. And every once in a while, Pi will fire off a shot to signal to other ships to come about or to come close so we can communicate with them. And of course, we have Bill G, our bilge rat, who's in charge of the rum. And even though he's part of the crew, he's not an officer, but he's nonetheless is very important to the running of the ship because
Dishes out the rum.
he dishes out the rum. Isn't that right, Bill G? There you go. Yep, he agrees. So, folks, this is our first episode about longitude and navigation at sea, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it encouraged you to take a closer look at this history and the idea of navigating over long distances by sea, and take a look at it for yourself and see what you think. And so we've just poured out a little bit more Madeira for our friends, and we say to you folks now, thank you so much for watching this episode of the Pied Round. I'm Captain Scotopus. This be my dear love, Scarlet Raven. And we want to say thank you so much. And we miss you, all our pirate friends and all our pirate fests. We miss you dearly, folks. And I want you to think about this and think and say, you know, we're going to get through this together, folks. We're going to make it. We're going to make it through. Take care of yourself. Take care of your friends. Wear your masks. And take care of the older members of the crew and the younger members of your crew and everyone in your families. And we miss you dearly. And we say to you now, folks, smooth sailing.
And always stay strong and always be a pirate.
Always stay strong. Always be a pirate.
In our hearts, smooth sailing.